By the spring of 1778, Philadelphia had been under British control for months. But the war was changing. France had entered the conflict, turning the American Revolution into an international war.
Rebels are concentrated here along the
For the
shore.
British, Philadelphia was becoming
Let us see what
increasingly
Sir William
difficult to
Howe
defend.
reports.
British commanders
Gentlemen,
now faced a
a
new
dispatch
strategic
from London.
reality. They needed to concentrate their
The
forces
French
in
have
New
signed a
York,
treaty with the
where the
rebels.
city was more important to
And
Britain's
this means
wider
war on a
military
global
position.
scale.
So the decision was made. The
By
British
crossing
would
the Jersey,
abandon
we can
Philadelphia,
secure New York.
but leaving
But
would
the
be
rebels
far
will
more
surely
difficult
harass
than
our
simply
flank.
marching away.
The water offers a
Thousands
much
of
safer
soldiers had to
passage.
move. Artillery had to be transported.
Move these
Food,
crates now!
ammunition, tents, weapons, equipment, and
Secure that
supplies
cannon!
all had to be packed onto wagons. And behind the army came an enormous baggage train. In June 1778, the evacuation finally began. Before sunrise, British troops started moving through Philadelphia. Scarlet-coated infantry marched through the streets as horses pulled wagons and artillery behind them. Civilians watched from the doorways of their homes as the British column slowly left the city. Once outside Philadelphia, the true scale of the movement became clear. The army stretched for miles across the countryside. The enormous baggage train slowed everything down. Heavy wagons struggled along rough roads while horses strained against their harnesses.
Put your shoulders to the wheel!
British scouts rode ahead, searching the countryside for signs of American forces. Because somewhere behind them, George Washington was watching. The British had abandoned Philadelphia, but they had not yet escaped Washington's army, and Washington was about to make his move. Washington quickly received word that the British had abandoned Philadelphia. He now had a decision to make. The British were moving toward New York, but their enormous baggage train was slowing them down. The opportunity was too important to ignore. Washington ordered the Continental Army to pursue. Across the American camp, orders spread quickly. Officers mounted their horses. Drums sounded. Soldiers gathered their equipment and prepared to march. After the terrible winter at Valley Forge, the Continental Army was different. The months of training had produced a force that was more organized, more disciplined, and better prepared for battle.
Ready your arms!
The army began moving toward New Jersey. Infantry marched along the roads while artillery and supply wagons followed behind. Washington rode with his officers, keeping the army moving forward. Meanwhile, the British column continued its difficult journey. The summer heat grew stronger. Thousands of soldiers marched beneath the sun, while hundreds of wagons carried the army's supplies. The horses suffered under the heavy loads. Teams struggled to pull wagons through difficult sections of road. Soldiers were forced to stop, repair equipment, and give exhausted animals water. Every delay helped Washington. The Continental Army was closing the distance. American scouts moved ahead through the countryside. Hidden among the trees and fields, they watched the British column and reported its movements. Their information confirmed what Washington needed to know. The British were still moving slowly. The opportunity for a confrontation was becoming real.
Old girl.
Washington pressed his army forward. The road ahead would lead both armies toward Monmouth. And soon, the British would realize that Washington was no longer simply following them. He was closing in. American scouts continued watching the British movements from the countryside. Then British scouts finally spotted the approaching Continental forces. The warning quickly reached British commanders. The American army was getting closer. The British now had to prepare for the possibility of battle. Officers gathered around maps and studied the roads, fields, and surrounding countryside. Defensive positions began to take shape near the Monmouth area. British infantry prepared their formations. Artillery crews positioned their cannons. Across the countryside, Washington's army continued advancing. The Continental soldiers moved through the summer heat toward the British route. The army that had suffered through Valley Forge was now marching as a much more disciplined fighting force. The distance between the two armies continued to shrink. Soon, only a few miles separated them. Washington's officers prepared their formations while artillery moved into position. The British did the same. For the first time since the evacuation of Philadelphia began, The two armies were moving toward the same battlefield. The countryside around Monmouth was about to become a testing ground for the rebuilt Continental Army. Washington knew that defeating the British would be difficult, but he also knew that his soldiers were no longer the same force that had entered Valley Forge months earlier. They had trained, they had learned to march together, they had learned to maneuver, and they had learned to fight with greater discipline. Now came the test. As the afternoon faded, both armies prepared their positions. British artillery waited behind the infantry. Continental artillery moved forward to support the American formations. Officers rode along the lines. Drums echoed across the fields. The soldiers could sense what was coming. The battle had not yet begun, but the battlefield was already taking shape. And by nightfall, thousands of men on both sides knew that morning could bring a major clash. As evening approached, British troops formed their lines across the countryside. Red-coated infantry stood ready while artillery crews prepared their guns. Across the fields, Continental soldiers formed their own positions. Washington's rebuilt army was finally approaching the battlefield. The Americans checked their muskets. Cartridge boxes were secured. Officers moved through the ranks, giving final instructions. Drummers waited for the signal. Washington rode along the Continental line on horseback. His soldiers watched as their commander passed. Months earlier, these men had endured one of the hardest winters of the Revolution. Now they stood ready to face the British Army. Across the countryside, British commanders watched the American positions carefully. The British were experienced veterans. They had fought throughout the colonies and knew the dangers of the American battlefield. But Washington's army had changed. The training at Valley Forge had created a more capable Continental force. As darkness settled over New Jersey, both armies established their camps. Campfires began glowing across the countryside. American soldiers prepared their equipment and rested beside the fires. Officers studied maps and discussed the coming battle. Across the fields, British soldiers did the same. Thousands of men waited through the night. Horses rested. Artillery crews remained close to their guns. The countryside became quiet, but the tension was unmistakable. Before sunrise, the first light would appear over Monmouth. The British had escaped Philadelphia, but Washington had followed them across New Jersey. After months of rebuilding, the Continental Army was ready. Now, Washington would finally put his new army to the test. The Battle of Monmouth was about to begin. Subscribe for Part 5, The Battle of Monmouth.